Tonight, green fraud. Stunning figures showing car makers grossly exaggerate how far electric cars really go. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister cons us about electric trucks. These are more signs that their clean energy plans are falling apart. They're getting desperate. Also tonight, I'll talk to the author of a book that should completely change the way people talk about colonialism. In fact, colonialism in many cases was good, and demands for compensation are a fraud. Do not miss that. Also tonight, America moves to ban TikTok, the Chinese-owned video platform. Should we do the same? And a former New Zealand Greens MP turned thief. Should you be surprised? Plenty more tonight, including Barnaby Joyce, my book of the week, and a whiskey that could be all gone by breakfast. But first, another day, another immigration stuff-up. This time, several Palestinians given passports by this government have had them cancelled when they were in transit in Egypt. This just the day after another government bungle when it admitted it gave invalid visas to the 149 foreign criminals, including murderers and rapists, it let out of immigration detention. And I've got to ask again, why has Immigration Minister Andrew Giles not been sacked already? But about these Palestinians. Now, I said for weeks, how could this government give more than 2,000 visas to Palestinians from terrorist-run Gaza and the West Bank? That's already one problem here, because we've already learned the hard way the dangers to us of importing people from war zones. Then another thing I've asked for weeks is why the Immigration Department took as little as a day to approve such visas. All of these ones issued since the start of Israel's war with the Hamas terrorist group that runs Gaza. How could you possibly do security assessments of these people in that time, especially when we don't have consular officials in place in Gaza? Now, the opposition was also amazed, but the Prime Minister back then made out they're just being mean, scaremongering.
He's just wrong, and you know what he does every day, you see it. It's just fear campaigns every day that don't have a basis in what is going on. ABC host Patricia Karvelis was also appalled that the Liberals were questioning these visas.
But there is no evidence that any of them are dangerous, is there? But are you talking about people being active, actual potential terrorists in this country, or their political ideology?
But it seems the government has belatedly had a second thought about these visas, has been tossing out like confetti to Palestinians. Now, one of the Palestinians that's turned back, a woman, has been told, well, actually, we reckon you lied to us. Not that you're a terrorist supporter, but as part of the visa application process, you were required to be genuinely intending to stay temporarily in Australia. But now the department's delegate considered you never intended a genuine stay temporarily. Well, no kidding, Sherlock. But there were also security concerns, were there, or maybe not, with this woman? None for this woman, but maybe for some of the others who have been now rejected. I don't know. But the thing is, I don't think the government would actually admit it if there were. The Prime Minister indeed flubbered his way through a press conference today, while Opposition Leader Peter Dutton went on the attack.
This has been a difficult situation for people, and I understand that it's a very difficult circumstance for families. The government makes, or these decisions are made upon advice based upon individuals.
The government's rushed here to issue these visas in a circumstance I can't understand how it's in our country's best interests, and it just seems to me that this is another thing that Minister Giles has botched.
What a clown show. Our borders and your security in Labor's hands. Now, there was a leak today, or should I say the government was floating an idea anonymously to test if we'd be naive enough to fall for it. It's a Labor plan to ban lies in political campaigns, with the Sydney Morning Herald promising there'd be real lies only, honest, that would be banned, you know. Well, under this plan, a new unit inside the Australian Electoral Commission would check election ads, and if it reckons they're false, it could ban them. Now, my first reaction was low. Labor wants to ban election lies like this one that helped Labor under Bill Shorten almost steal a miracle win against Malcolm Turnbull's Liberals.
You can either have Malcolm Turnbull or you can have Medicare, but you can't have both.
Malcolm Turnbull has set up a Medicare privatisation task force.
Everybody knows you don't set up a Medicare privatisation task force unless you aim to privatise Medicare.
That was always a Labor lie. The Liberals obviously had no such plans, and even more obviously has since sold Medicare. But that lie helped to cost the coalition 14 seats.
The Labor Party ran some of the most systematic, well-funded lies ever peddled in Australian politics, telling vulnerable Australians that Medicare was going to be privatised or sold, frightening people.
Malcolm have tanty. But what about this Labor lie before the last election?
Reducing power prices by $275.
By 2025, $275 a year.
$275 a year.
We'll get power prices down by $275 a year.
Joining me from Toowoomba is the Nationals frontbencher Barnaby Joyce, the former Deputy Prime Minister, always here on a Thursday. Barnaby, thanks for your time. Look, I'm happy if Labor now repents its sins, but I'm against this planned ban on political lies because I don't trust our political class and our bureaucrats to know the difference between a real lie and an unpopular truth. Do you?
Well, it's funny you bring up lies and repentance, and we're sitting here in Easter, and it sort of draws me to Pontius Pilate, quid est veritas. What is truth? What is truth? And of course, we know what truth is. Truth will be what they say, and lies will be apparently what we say, and this will be directed for yet another form of sort of quasi-control of the political narrative in their behalf. Now, yeah, if we want to run out some lies, here's another lie they said. Renewables are the cheapest form of power. Is your power bill going down? Do you feel you have spare cash? Do you feel you have spare cash with your power bill? That it wouldn't affect anything? Do you see that we're losing Qenos, our plastic manufacturers, our aluminium industry is going? We've got no prospect of expanding a manufacturing industry because we don't have cheap energy. The whole thing is a fiasco. We had power prices down in Victoria after the storm that went up to $16,200 a megawatt unit for something that generally costs around about $32. $32 to $16,200. And they sold in 5-minute blocks. I tell you, if we're going to go to the confessional, the political confessional of truth and lies, you can bet your life the Labor Party are going to be in there for a very long time, so take a packed lunch if you're sitting in the pool.
Yeah, but they can they can usually trust the bureaucracy because it tends to be filled with people of the left. I mean, it's just a fact of life. Yeah, of course. Barnaby, you mentioned the Green Plan.
You change the government, you don't change the bureaucracy. Sorry?
It's spot on. But Barnaby, you mentioned you're right. This green revolution of Labor's the plan to replace our coal-fired electricity plants with wind and solar, they are in total chaos. And I think we saw two signs of that today, just over the last few days. First, of course, investment in renewables has cratered from $6.5 billion 2 years ago to just a quarter of that last year. Labor's got much less investment in what it needs much more of. Plus, there are now moves in 2 states to shut down communities who are trying to stop these massive wind towers and transmission lines that Labor wants to build. They want to stop them from spoiling their landscape. New South Wales, renewable energy developers want the New South Wales government to slash the buffer zone between wind farms and nearby communities so they don't have to negotiate with as many residents. And Victoria's Premier wants to cut approval times for new renewable energy projects from up to 2 years now to as little as 4 months by limiting appeals. Here she is.
This change will mean that it prevents time-consuming and repeated delays that hold these projects back for years. We can do both. We can preserve the opportunity for communities to have their say as the projects go through those processes, but we need to preserve our momentum. We need to get the decisions made more quickly, and we need to provide that certainty.
Yeah. There's a panic now, isn't there, Barnaby, about the green rollout, and it seems country people are going to get steamrolled.
It's anathema to what Australia's supposed to be. This is the greatest swindle of your political lifetime. We are having overseas multinational companies and domestic carpetbaggers who are turning up, getting a deemed rate of return, power pricing agreements, renewable energy credits, subsidised infrastructure that has been forcing your power price through the roof, your reliability through the floor, and the overseas companies, so your money goes overseas. But it's not enough. It is not enough that they only be 8 kilometres from your house. Now they want to be, 1.5? And yet we've got the Labor Party going out on behalf of Chinese real estate companies, Singaporean companies, Dutch companies, French companies, who don't care about the environment and they don't care about global warming. They care about making money. And they're making bucket loads out of you, the taxpayer. You are getting ripped off, absolutely ripped off. And we sit back and we let it happen. Do you know they're coming in onto our land with a state-owned enterprise, Energy Co, so that they can basically compulsorily acquire our properties? We're doing this. We're this industrial landscape of wind factories, solar factories, filth that's going to, when it obviously becomes obsolete, is going to be left there as a permanent memento to our stupidity of what we did to our nation.
It sure is.
I mean, you know how ludicrous it's
Monuments
a cult. It's a cult. You know how ludicrous this cult is? Listen to this. Listen to this. You'll like this. You'll run with this in your headlines. Listen to this. They have just declared, wait for it, that Tamworth is an alpine area. And has to get new building instructions, has to be black on the outside, black roofs. They're talking about double glazing the windows. Tamworth is about 350 metres above sea level. It is red hot. And when you've got stupidity like that, that's no joke. That's exactly what we're doing.
You're going to have to invest in more Parkers, obviously. Barnaby Joyce.
When do we call rubbish on this?
Thank you so much for your time. Oh, look, I know. We've been trying to do it for ages. The penny is going to drop. Don't get depressed yet. The penny will drop. Barnaby Joyce, thanks for your time. I've been talking about the hoo-ha about global warming. It's going to devastate food sources. I saw that the other day. Do you know China, and this is bad news for farmers, has just cancelled or delayed 1 million metric tonnes reportedly of Australian wheat, not because it hates us, but because there's a glut now of worldwide wheat, where actually the world is growing apparently almost too much wheat. Can you believe that? So much for global warming. Something's changed, though, in the economy. Treasurer Jim Chalmers was lucky for his first 2 budgets. So were the rest of us, of course. The prices we were getting for our coal and iron ore exports were crazy. Now, without that, the government's budget would be in the red and the country would be in recession. But today, Jim Chalmers gave a speech warning that the next budget, in May, won't be so pretty. China is struggling, iron ore prices are on the way down because they make steel, and there won't be cash for big giveaways.
Any extra help will be targeted, responsible and affordable. There will not be big cash splashes in the budget. It's as simple as that.
Joining me is the country's top finance writer, Terry McCrann of the Herald Sun. Terry, great to see you again. Is Jim Chalmers right when he says we're now in new territory, the best of the tax windfalls are behind us, got to tighten our belts? I would have thought we should have tightened our belts a couple of budgets ago, but there you go. What do you make of his speech?
Well, the short answer, Andrew, is yes, we are in new territory. Obviously, we had that wonderful windfall over the last 2 years where the government got something like $100 billion of extra revenue. $100 billion in 2 years. That's $100 billion a year in this last year. And it spent about 80 billion of that in one form or another. And Jim Chalmers wants to be told that he's a wonderful frugal Scrooge because he only spent 80 billion of the 100 billion. He saved, quote unquote, the tiny bit, $20 billion, and therefore got his surplus last year. And we'll have another surplus in this financial year, which is just ending. This is about 10% about the economy and about the things that matter to you, Andrew, to you viewers, rather, cost of living, interest rates, energy prices, so on. And it's about 90% politics. Politics directed at his cabinet colleagues. I want to keep your sticky fingers off the spending. I don't want to lock in spending this year. And that's the second part of the politics. Next year is the spending budget. Next year, we're going to have a budget in March and an election in May, unless the Prime Minister decides to go to an early election. So this is all about preparing the way for that process, the budget in March and then the election. But what it is telling you, Andrew, and telling your viewers, the economy has had its good day. And it was all about population growth, and it was all about migration, and all about those massive revenues from iron ore and coal, which, of course, this government wants to just close down and end.
Well, that's the irony, isn't it? The government had its bacon saved by particularly fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, exports of. These are exactly the industries that the left want to shut down. I mean, it's just so extraordinary. I wish they'd come to terms with this. But speaking of this madness, Terry, later in the show, I'm going to show how car makers wildly exaggerate the real-life range of electric cars, which makes them, of course, electric cars even less likely to be the way to cut emissions because you've got to top them up more often with coal-fired power. Much less attractive to buy. But what do you think of the government's new so-called fuel efficiency standards to force Australians to buy more of these electric vehicles?
It's a fraud, Andrew. It's an exercise in Orwellian newspeak. You define efficient fuel. I mean, your viewers would say, if this car is more fuel efficient than the other car, it's because I get more kilometres out of it, out of 1 litre of petrol compared to the other car. It's more efficient. It drives me further. But the way they've defined, and this is the only definition in the rules, fuel efficiency is by the emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide, which has got nothing to do with the actual efficiency of the fuel. It's all about the crazy climate cult of carbon dioxide. So you say a car which emits less CO2 is more fuel efficient, which is a nonsense. And obviously the cars, but only the car, you don't worry about where you get the power from, the car itself, electric cars obviously emit zero CO2. So they're wonderfully fuel efficient under the definition. You read the definition, you say that that's the only car that's going to be fuel efficient. Obviously diesels under this definition are woefully inefficient, and they will be driven out of people's garages and driven out of the hands of tradies over the next 10 years is what the government wants to achieve.
Except, of course, the electric vehicles are not zero emissions because they take many more emissions to make because of the battery in particular, and they use electricity from our coal and gas generators. More than 60%, 2/3 actually is. And if they've got to refuel more often than we're told, they're starting to look really dodgy. Terry McCrean, thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, we'll talk more about this electric car con because there's been a test now to show they don't go anywhere near as far as you're told. And meanwhile, good heavens, what a coincidence. Anthony Albanese today, the Prime Minister, cons you about electric trucks as well, using your money. It seems people who buy electric cars are being conned. Many don't go anywhere near as far as claimed on a full charge. The British car magazine What Car decided to test the range that the car makers claim for their cars.
We've got 12 cars here, and we're going to drive them all in real-world conditions until they die.
Now, what the magazine did was drive 12 kinds of electric cars in real-world conditions. A bit of stop-starts, city-type traffic, then longer stretches at 80 k's and 100 kilometres an hour, all in a bit of cool winter weather, though, and they did it again and again until the car stopped.
Oh, I'm getting overtaken by everyone. I'm losing power. I'm dropping. I'm down to 59 miles an hour, 58, 55. I think this is going to be a really, really painful, slow death now.
Now, the result they found was that the real range of these cars in real conditions was as much as 40% of what the manufacturers claimed. 40% less. Not one car got within 20% of the official figures for the car range. The worst underperformer was a Lexus UX 300e Takumi. The next was another Lexus RZ 450e Takumi. The best was a Mercedes. Joining me is Paul Gover, former car racer and one of our most experienced motoring journalists, even inducted into the Supercars Media Hall of Fame, so he knows what he's talking about. Paul Gover, thanks for your time again. What do these tests tell you?
Well, they tell me what I already knew, Andrew. Very rarely do electric cars live up to their range claims. Now, there are lots of tests of combustion engines which will tell you they don't get the great fuel economy sometimes they're advertised. The thing with a combustion car is you can pull into a service station. Let me tell you, when you're driving an electric car, it's always in the back of your mind, where is the nearest life raft?
Look, you have actually been talking, and on this very show, about your doubts about the range. There is one thing I should point out. Those cars were tested in British conditions, so a little cooler than Australian conditions generally. Would that make a difference to the range? Would you be more likely to get closer to the range that the car makers claim in Australia than you would in Britain? Because I think, isn't it, that the batteries are more efficient in slightly warmer conditions?
Yeah, that's true, Andrew. They are better in slightly warmer conditions. The thing about it is you also have to heat the battery if it gets very, very cold. Now, that's probably not the situation they were doing during this test. But the other thing about this is in the real world, you actually get the best range out of an electric car in stop-start traffic. If you go and drive on the highway or somewhere out in the countryside where you've got a constant drain on the battery, that's actually the worst conditions, which again is when you're most worried about how far you're going to go before the thing stops.
Now, if the range is less than advertised, and it clearly is, when you drive in real-world conditions, doesn't this mean that electric cars are even less likely to cut emissions as advertised, because they then need even more charges of electricity to get to where they're going? And in Australia, that is still predominantly electricity made from coal and gas.
Yes, that is absolutely true, Andrew. And I'll tell you something else. One of my colleagues in the motoring press recently drove from Newcastle in New South Wales up to Brisbane. Now, that's a trip I can do comfortably in about 7.5 hours, stopping once to refuel, and even then in many combustion cars you don't have to. Took him over 12 hours. And the other thing that people don't tell you about is just the number of the recharging stations around the place that are inoperable or very slow. Everybody talks about wondrous recharging times with the very fast chargers that are around the place. But there aren't very many of them. And interestingly, I got him to drop into my place. There's a fast charger near me. It was great. We had an hour to chat because somebody had arrived 5 minutes before him, plugged their car in, and he had to wait for an hour while their vehicle charged.
Well, it's a good way to make friends, I guess, looking on the bright side. But I tell you what, the more often you have to charge, obviously, means also the electric cars are becoming more and more expensive to run. We've already seen a drive off between two Mercedes, Melbourne and Sydney. The Mercedes petrol version came out cheaper to run for that trip than did the electric one. Now, Paul, the Prime Minister today was spruiking the delivery of 43 electric trucks, most of them Volvo EFL electric trucks, at Team Global Express. Here he is.
This is a game changer. 1/3 of the heavy vehicles operating out of this very big facility in Western Sydney will be all electric.
Now, the Prime Minister was saying these electric trucks were a game changer. Here they were right behind him. These trucks in Britain actually cost twice as much as the comparable diesel one. And the ones the Prime Minister was promoting today were only bought with the help of a $20 million assistance from the Australian renewable energy agencies. I mean, given all that, how much of a game changer can these trucks really be?
Zero. Apart from anything else, he's talking about, I did a bit of research, they're talking about 60 trucks. And they're not heavy trucks, despite what Prime Minister might have said. When we talk about heavy trucks, you and I are thinking about B-doubles out on the highway or articulated trucks. These are vehicles that are going to do short-haul deliveries around cities. The other thing is, 48, I think they're delivering, and the total is going to be 60 trucks. 60 electric trucks. Well, there are over 150,000 trucks on Australian roads at the moment. I'm not very good at maths, Andrew. Perhaps you get our old mate, Mr. McCran, to work it out. Okay. But 60 trucks against 150,000, what game is he playing that he thinks this is going to change it?
And is everyone buying a truck going to get a good, nice little financial assistance from the Albanese government? I don't think so. Paul Gover, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. After the break, I'm going to talk to the most dangerous man I've had on this show. He is just a professor, but he has now written a great book explaining just why colonialism is not a dirty word at all, but often was a very good thing in a lot of countries, ours too. We'll watch this important discussion if you dare after this, because when he said that, the death threats were astonishing. In a second, I'll talk to a man who says colonialism was actually pretty good. But first, here's a quick look at what's coming up on Shari.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, tonight, how Labor is cozying up to China at the expense of our national security, plus yet another immigration bungle with reports a number of Palestinians have had their visas cancelled with no explanation. I'll see you at 8.
Now I'm about to talk to a man who's too dangerous for most media to touch. He's Bruce Gilley, a professor of political science and public policy at Portland, the US. 7 years ago, he wrote a paper called The Case for Colonialism, why colonial empires like the British one that once spanned so much of the globe, including Australia, had actually been a force for good, just as National's frontbencher Jacinta Price suggested last year, shocking many journalists.
Do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. I mean, everything that my grandfather had when he was growing up, because he first saw whitefellas in his early adolescence, we now have.
But Bruce Gilley got the treatment. Half the people on the board of the academic magazine that ran his paper quit in protest. There were so many death threats, the paper was then censored. How could Gilley praise colonialisation, which is now such a filthy word, something... Colonialism, the King Charles, he apologises for it.
There are elements of that history which provoke profound sorrow.
Professor Bruce Gilley has now expanded his paper into a book with the same title and lots more evidence, The Case for Colonialism, and he joins me now. Bruce Gilley, thank you so much indeed for your time. With all the abuse you got for writing the paper on which this book is based, abuse from academics, everyone, people trying to cancel you, the whole thing. First, why was there that rage and why did you bother sticking your head up again for another round?
Yeah, well, as you suspect, I didn't stick my head up in the first case because I didn't expect I was sticking my head up. There had been actually a lot of people writing things about the positive aspects of colonialism. It had been bubbling below the surface. Nobody had titled it The Case for Colonialism, but if I had given it some obscure academic title, probably there wouldn't have been such a storm. And at first, my response was, this is not worth it. I apologized. I took the paper down. I mean, I did everything that a fearful peasant in the Cultural Revolution would have done until I realized I was being mobbed. and I needed to stand back up. So I spent essentially the next 5 years arguing back with my critics, none of whom were willing to stand on a stage and debate me, despite apparently thousands of tenured academics around the world, including in Australia, signing petitions and showing how sure they were of their premises, but nobody was willing to stand on a stage with me and debate it. But I felt that the backlash and the mob attack was in some ways indicative of how important it was to get this argument out. And that's why I finally turned it into the book, The Case for Colonialism.
Here's the thing that always struck me. How could a tiny country like Britain rule a huge one like India without a lot of Indians having wanted that too and participating, joining the British Army or the Indian Army then under British rule? Or you take New Zealand, the Maori tribes actually asked to be colonised so Britain could help stop almost genocidal tribal warfare there. This kind of collaboration, the welcoming or the passive acceptance, did this actually give colonialism legitimacy in many places?
Did, yeah. So we call those the pull factors as opposed to the push factors. And the other great lie of the anti-colonial establishment in the universities and in the commentariat is that somehow colonialism was forced upon people. It was not forced upon anyone. It was invariably achieved because it was sought out. It was sought out by either groups which understood the benefits of being ruled by a modern liberal state, was sought out by peoples facing extinction from their traditional rivals, or simply sought out, as you suggest, because people realized there was a lot to gain from a self-interest perspective, even without some national idea. The other thing to remember is, what was before in most of these places was not a nation, was not a people, was often not even a settled area. I mean, a place like Hong Kong and Singapore were literally created from scratch by colonialism, and surprisingly large number of African states today were also literally created out of scratch. There was nobody there. Southern Africa, many parts of West Africa. And so what we remember is that not only the colonialists were brought in and sought, there was a rivalry to have the colonialists come among the different peoples and to be their main partners, but also that what the British or the French or the Germans or the Portuguese found in all these cases was essentially a scattered, highly fragmented society with very little infrastructure, very little communications, virtually no governance traditions to speak of other than maybe pre-modern princedoms as in India. And it's because it was so patently good for these places that colonialism spread so easily. Why a little place like Britain could rule a place like India, because the people in India whose Mughal dynasty had collapsed, who were about to be put under the gentle rule of the Shah of Persia, who I think announced his arrival in Delhi by murdering 50,000 people, they recognized this was by far the best alternative, especially the poor. And this is the other thing that the anti-colonial scholars don't like to admit, because most of them come from upper caste or upper class parts of their societies, is the poor were the big supporters of colonialism because they were sick and tired of being ruled by these inherited and traditional elites in their societies. And the result was colonialism was the most natural thing in the world. It was going to happen one way or another. There was very little push. There was very little planning. It was a natural consequence of universal human desires for self-betterment.
Well, how do you explain the fact that now anti-colonialism is a business? And I mean that like with money involved. You've got the argument that Western wealth was built on colonialism. The colonialists stole the wealth of the colonized countries, dragging all this money from India to Britain, for instance, stealing the land in Australia and all the resources there. You hear now demands for reparations from countries in the Caribbean and Africa in particular, Aboriginal activists here, not so much from Asia though, interestingly. Is that true, that colonisation made colonised peoples poor and there's a lot of stolen wealth that should be returned?
It's complete nonsense. As you know, any serious economic historian knows that the main problem with colonialism was that it was too much of an economic drain on the colonizing countries. It was an uneconomic enterprise, and it ended up being sustained largely for reasons of national pride, national strategy, religious fervor, liberal nationalism. One thing that did not sustain colonial rule was that it was a great deal for the colonizing countries. It wasn't. The costs and burdens of empire were far, far in excess of any minor transfers that went back. And most of this is just straightforward economic illiteracy, Andrew. I mean, people think that, natural resources are just kind of buried in the ground and you just need to come and pull them out and put them in a bank and suddenly you become rich. I mean, colonialism created all of the infrastructure of a modern economy, and all of that infrastructure would not have come absent colonialism. And this is why these resource-rich countries all dwindled into failed states as soon as the colonial governance system was gone. All that stuff is still there in the ground, but it's useless without an institutional structure. I don't mind talking about reparations. I think reparations is a great idea, but if you're going to talk reparations, the reparations are going to go in the other way. Every single person in India should pay a huge reparation to the British people for what the Brits did for India. All of the Aboriginal and Native American peoples should pay reparations. All of the people of Black Africa who were lucky enough to escape from Black Africa as a result of slavery, or most of them by migration, if they want to talk about reparations, let's do it, because Africa would be on the hook for a lot of money. I don't think that makes sense, because I don't think that's how history plays out. And I think that kind of apportioning guilt and blame is completely ridiculous. But if you want to play that game, the reparations are going to go in the other way.
Yes, it's always struck me. I mean, obviously, I find the concept of slavery abhorrent. Absolutely. But if you're talking reparations, the descendants of slaves in America are living, on average, much, much richer lives, measured in dollars, than the people in the countries that their ancestors came from. I mean, there's something a little askew there. Australia, I don't know how familiar you are with the situation here. Anti-colonialism, you see banners and protests and all that, but it's the great sin. No one can quite explain exactly, maybe the importation of diseases or, the theft of the land, all right. But the living standards that the descendants of Aborigines today seem way higher than their ancestors ever enjoyed. What is the case for colonialism here?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you really need to compare it to is the standards of living of Aboriginal peoples who are no longer living under a settler colonial regime like in Australia. So I guess you're looking at peoples of the South Pacific in the independent countries of the South Pacific. I mean, that's the counterfactual. Last time I checked, those peoples were desperate to migrate to Australia because the standard of living is better and the rule of law is better and your rights and opportunities are better. Of course they are. And, nothing ever stopped Aboriginal peoples from essentially opting out of the Australian state, opt out of the welfare system, opt out of the legal system. You can perfectly do that. We have that in North America. We have reserves. Most people of Indigenous ancestry, of which there are virtually none now, by the way, in terms of purebloods or even half-bloods. But those who claim it and are enrolled, none of them want to live on the reservations. Of course not. Why would you live in a pre-modern society when you can live in a modern society and have your cake and eat it too? Live in the modern society, enjoy all of its benefits, and decry all the evils it's perpetrated upon you. I mean, it's hypocritical beyond belief. And, I think the reason why these activists get so much play is because nobody can even be bothered to try and argue with them. The problem with that then is that you get a very small activist majority or minority kind of carrying the majority along, really just because nobody wants to speak out against it. That's okay when it's just about, relabeling museums and whatnot. But when you get to talking about, separate constitutional lives, as you've had in Australia, and as we're having discussions in the United States and Canada, people will finally start to stand up and the truth will start to come out.
Bruce Gilley, fascinating stuff. I must say, after everything I've been reading about Portland being a liberal haven or a hellhole, whatever you want to say, this is the last thing I expected to hear from that particular place. But thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you. It's been great.
After the break, America is moving to ban the Chinese-owned TikTok as a threat to national security. Why won't the Albanese government do the same here? Plus the thieving Greens MP and my whiskey tip of the week, my book tip too. Well, America is moving to ban TikTok, the Chinese-owned TikTok. It's a national security risk, they say. It's been overwhelmingly passed in the House of Reps, and now has to go to the Senate to see if that should be law now. But in Australia, I don't know, for some reason, I mean, if it's a national security risk in America, why wouldn't it be the same here? But the Prime Minister seemed a little bit iffy about it all. Here he is.
We don't follow other countries. What we do is we make decisions based on our security assessments.
I think the Prime Minister, particularly at a time like this, doesn't need to be weak if he's got advice from the agencies, which I believe he has, that the information is being hoovered up and young people don't have a safe presence online. It's up to the Prime Minister of our country to respond in the appropriate way.
I know it sounds really innocent, this TikTok, videos of people singing and dancing and all that kind of stuff, but I don't know. 8.5 million Australians use it. Maybe that's what the Prime Minister's got in mind. Anyway, joining me is the panel, James McPherson of The Late Debate here on Sky News at 10 p.m, and Louise Elliott, business consultant and Hobart City Councillor. James, should we ban TikTok here as well?
Yeah, I think we should, and there's a number of reasons why. We already acknowledge that there are strong links between TikTok and the Chinese Communist Party, acknowledged by the government, who've banned the app from government phones because it is a security risk. That's already acknowledged. But it's not just the data collection which is a problem. As Peter Dutton pointed out, the corrupting effect of TikTok on our young people is not accidental. US 60 Minutes did a program some time ago pointing out that the version of TikTok Chinese children are allowed is very different to the version that is promoted to Western young people. Certainly the content is different. In China, their kids get history, they get science. In Australia, they get gender theory and anti-Western sentiment. And not only is it corrupting, but the medium itself is bad for our young people. In China, they're unable to just scroll mindlessly for hours on TikTok because it's interrupted with 5-second delays, so scrolling is inefficient, whereas the Western version enables our young people to sit online just scrolling like zombies for hours on end. In China, they have time restrictions for how long children are allowed to use it. No such restrictions in Western nations. So it's very obviously a weapon of mass distraction used by the Chinese Communist Party to have a corrupting influence on our young people. And if we don't recognise that, we're crazy. Of course, the government should at the very least be looking at this very seriously.
And of course, it's got algorithms, so it can actually steer certain news items that it wants, or themes to the top of your search list, and others that it doesn't want to the bottom. I don't know, Louise Elliott, what do you reckon? Ban or not ban?
Well, I don't jump to bans pretty quickly at the best of times, but I think in this situation, it's something where the government really should be taking a stand on because there is so much at risk. What I suspect Mr Albanese is probably worried about is losing probably half of his voters, given the audience for TikTok's probably, the under 30s, so he'd worry about losing that fan club. But I think given, like I said, the risks, and given, like James said, the impact on society, how much good is it actually doing? So I'd be very happy to see it go.
Very interesting crime story in New Zealand. Maybe I'm making too much of this, but I don't know. A Greens MP, former Greens MP, she's resigned now, and former human rights lawyer, Golriz Garaman. She was forced to resign and has now pleaded guilty to 4 counts of shoplifting clothes worth $9,000. I thought they paid MPs more than that. Just why she did it, it's still a bit of a mystery, but I'm struck by what she told Parliament in her first speech there.
One of the greatest threats to both human and nature's rights right now is subjugation of our democracy to corporate interests, a rampant market on a finite planet.
James, is there a clue there? I mean, if you're so against corporate interests, if you think they're a threat to democracy and even to the planet, you might actually think that shoplifting is not such a crime after all. I'm speculating generally here.
Yeah, well, I mean, for this lady, someone who rages against corporate greed, she certainly has expensive taste. She stole a $4,500 dress and a $695 shirt, can you believe it? But more generally, Andrew, to your point, I think when you believe that you represent a righteous cause, then you can pretty much justify doing anything. We saw this with Black Lives Matter. They excused looting, saying, well, it's just people taking what's theirs, it's reparations. We see it with climate protesters. They protest about food shortages by throwing food up against walls. And we see it with people in this instance who rage against corporate greed. If you think corporations are anti-democracy, then you probably feel justified about ripping them off. And that's the problem when you have no humility because you believe your cause is a righteous cause and therefore you believe that you are entitled to get away with things that other people cannot.
Louise, I've actually got to switch quickly to another topic while I've still got time because I want to help Tasmania, and you are a very loyal Tasmanian. Our tourism industry is doing it remarkably tough. In 2019, before the pandemic, we got 9.4 million foreign tourists. Last year, we only got 7.3. That's more than 2 million fewer. Now, in contrast, Europe's tourism is almost exactly where it was before. Are we doing something wrong? Are we not worth visiting anymore? This is your clue to plug Tasmania, I guess. But is it that the world has believed the lies of so many activists that, you know, this country is racist, our Great Barrier Reef is dying, if not dead already, so why bother coming?
Well, I think you're right. There's definitely something going on. You can feel down here that the tourism numbers aren't what they were. They're recovering, but not anything like they used to be. But I think we have to realise that as Australia, we are remote, we are expensive to get to. We're even more expensive when airlines try to come in and they're shoved away by the federal government. I didn't really hear what happened to the Qatar Airlines issue in the end. But we are an expensive place to visit. So all of those factors add up. And of course, we need to have the positive messages out there that we do have, happy and healthy and fair people to come and visit because, so much of our economy relies on tourism. And if you haven't been down to Tassie, I hear it's great this time of year.
But James, of course, let's not forget that China was also discouraging tourism to Australia to punish us. So maybe that's had an impact. I don't know.
Well, I think we took a hit during the pandemic, Andrew. Remember, Paul Hogan and Crocodile Dundee and even Lara Bingle. Australia was presented as this carefree country where, we were just so relaxed. And then at COVID and the pandemic, the whole world saw a very different side of Australia. I think we've lost some of our shine.
Yes. James McPherson, Louise Elliott, thank you both to you. And take it from me, my tips every Thursday. Well, my book of the week has to be the one we were talking about before, The Case for Colonialism by Professor Bruce Gilley. Very powerful stuff. Will change your thinking, or should, if you follow evidence and not fashion when you make up your mind. As always, you can go to the Robinson's Bookshop website and you'll see on the left of their webpage a link to my book tips, including now this book. There might be some delays in getting this one from overseas, but this one is a must. I should also mention Barnaby Joyce was in Toowoomba this evening. He was there because he was helping launch the autobiography of his former Nationals colleague, former Senator Ron Boswell. Boswell's called it not pretty, but pretty effective. And he did all right for a bloke who left school at 14. Good guy. And my whiskey of the week, well, I haven't tasted it, but the Lark Distillery in Tasmania opened its website today for buyers to register interest in buying just one of 188 bottles of whiskey aged in a single Burgundy cognac cask. $350. That's the kind of rarity thing, the individual stories of each whiskey that makes whiskey lovers crazy with desire. So if you want to have got that money, go for it. I've got Lark, not that one, but it's I think it's terrific. This one, small oak aged from the barrel, fantastic. That's it from me. Sherry up next.